Very excited for today's webinar, Transit Impacts on Jobs, People, and Real Estate. We have Arthur C. Nelson and Kristina Currans from the University of Arizona. Unfortunately, our third presenter, Robert Hibberd, can't be with us today. My name is Brendan Williams. I'm the Research Program Administrator at Portland State University's Transportation Research and Education Center. TREC leads the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, a university transportation center funded by the US Department of Transportation. NITC's research priority is improving mobility of people and goods to build strong communities. NITC consortium members are the University of Utah, University of Oregon, University of Arizona, University of Texas at Arlington, and Oregon Institute of Technology. All right, so Dr. Arthur C. Nelson is a professor of urban planning and real estate development at the University of Arizona. His major teaching and research areas include metropolitan development, policy and patterns, smart growth, public facility planning and finance, real estate development, metropolitan governance, and urban infill and redevelopment methods. Dr. Kristina Currans is an assistant professor of urban planning at the University of Arizona. She studies the intersection between transportation and land use development. Her work bridges the transportation planning and engineering disciplines. Her current research and teaching emphasizes rethinking and redeveloping new data and methods for applications and practice to help communities plan for the places they want. And yeah, like I said, Robert can't be with us. He is a doctoral student in geography and development with a minor in planning at the University of Arizona, and he made significant contributions to this research. So we want to recognize him and hope he's feeling better. So the upcoming NITC events to promote, we have Rethinking Streets During COVID, presenting by Mark Schlossberg, coming up on April 6th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And in May, on May 11th at 10 a.m., we have Eliminating Cash Options for Public Transit Fares, Costs, Benefits, and Equity Impacts, presented by Aaron Golub from the Portland State University. And our June webinar is on June 8th at 10 a.m., Electric Bus Deployment, Cost and Environmental Equity, presented by Kathy Liu. All right, so this presentation, there's a lot of slides, so we're going to be moving real quick through this. The final report is posted online, so you can look through all, I think, almost 700 pages when you have time to do that. But we're going to try and leave 15 minutes for Q&A. Please submit your questions in the Q&A, and that's how we'll prioritize it. There's a lot of participants, so put them in as we go along or at the end. After the webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to the video recording and presentation slides. If you're tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. Instructions on how to redeem the credit will be included in your post-webinar email. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over, and I am going to try to allow Chris to control the screen.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Nothing's happening.
Let me try again. Here we go.
Okay. Oh, okay. So
Was this me?
I don't know who that is. Okay, I'll start. So good morning, everybody, or maybe good afternoon in some parts of the country. I'm Chris Nelson, Arthur Christian Nelson. I go by Chris among friends. Your old friends call me Chris. I'm pleased to be part of a team that is wrapping up almost a decade's worth of research sponsored by NITC. Our work has been focusing on evaluating outcomes to light rail, bus rapid transit, streetcar, and commuter rail transit systems across the country. And this is the fourth of our reports. We call this the final phase. Well, nothing's final, of course, but this is a stage where other people can jump off from our platform. Here are the metropolitan areas we've studied over the years, and that we include in our study that we're going to summarize here. And I can't advance for some reason. There we go. These are the metropolitan areas that we use. So we have more than 50 transit systems we're evaluating in more than 30 metropolitan areas, all highlighted with these pin marks, excluding New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, some of the oldest and or very largest metropolitan areas because they have so many multiple fixed route transit systems that we can't tease apart, separate effects between systems. But we have the rest of the country pretty well covered. Trying to advance. We're going to cover 6 elements very quickly, given the time constraints. I'll introduce how transit systems should affect location of jobs and people, and how real estate rent should respond. I will be speaking for Robert Hibberd. He and his family, unfortunately, came down with COVID last week, a couple of weeks ago. They're somehow cases are doing fine, thankfully, but I'm taking over for his presentation. He will, oh, actually, this is not exactly right. Kristina Currans will follow me with a presentation of a typology of different landscapes we use for analysis. Then I will step in for Robert to talk about how transit stations influence shifts in the regional share of jobs, people, and housing. I will then follow up by looking at the effects of transit systems, transit stations on household transportation budgets, and then follow that by effects on real estate rents, and presenting a theory about how real estate markets should respond to a transit to station proximity. And by the way, that would be a good signal for us to measure the extent to which transit systems actually work as intended. Then we'll conclude with some implications for transit and land use planning. Trying to advance. So basically, we have 4 things that we're going to be looking at, or three main things. Transit stations and transit systems ought to improve accessibility across large regions. If that happens, then the nodes, the transit stations themselves, will be attractors to jobs, because jobs depend on interactions with other jobs around the metropolitan area, not just next door jobs, but down the rail jobs. They should also attract people and households to be near them. And they should also affect real estate rents in certain ways. If these things don't happen, we could conclude that transit stations and transit systems might not be performing as expected or as intended. But as you'll see, it's a mixed bag. Some do, some don't, and we'll talk about the implications of that towards the end. So moving along, Kristina Currans will then present or outline our place typologies, methodology, and outcomes. Kristina.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. You can go to the next slide. So in my work in this project, one of the main things that I was working on was developing some place typologies that we can use to study these systems together. And that was a unique challenge that this project and this series of projects has approached, where many of these studies focus on one system, one region. We're trying to do a lot of comparisons across regions. So we started with a really detailed white and academic literature review. And one of the early things that we realized was that the academic literature really approached these problems differently than the way that practitioners were thinking. We wanted this work to be very practically applied and understandable. So we wanted to make sure that we captured both voices in our understanding of place types. We found that Bertolini's series of papers related to framing transit-oriented development quantitatively was particularly useful in the way that they thought about both transit orientation, and development as separate but related entities. Go ahead and go to the next slide. This literature review, one of the big things that came out of it were us identifying our guiding principles for this work. So the first principle we identified was that we really wanted these typologies to capture existing variation in the built environments across all of the cities and systems that we were looking at. So we wanted to pick common measures that were used in practice and also identified in academic literatures and proxies for the built environment with data that was commonly available in practice. Next slide. We wanted the categories to be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. This came out of the realization that looking at many of the academic approaches to developing transit typologies, the way that cities outside of our study cities would sort of classify their areas required more algorithms, discrimination analysis, and things like that. So we wanted the ability to sort of figure out, okay, what is this place to be relatively easy to find for cities that we weren't looking at. So you could sort of translate these findings to your city more easily. Next slide. And lastly, and perhaps most challenging, we wanted these typologies to enable a comparison of similar environments across cities. So one of the biggest challenges of this project was that we were looking at systems that were vastly different. The urban and regional distribution of densities, for example, varied quite a bit across the study areas that we were looking at. And so we wanted to pick a method that enabled us to look at very similar built environments across those cities to look at the market responses to transit in different ways. Next slide. So we identified 4 categories of approaches. The first is manual classification. We see this most commonly in smaller studies or practice, where as a practicing planner or a transit planner, you kind of have a feel for what each station means to your area and its role in the system and the environment within it's in. Next, we found thresholds and qualifying criteria. These were sort of dummy variables that indicated, yes, this is a transit-oriented development, but didn't necessarily provide much more detailed information about the differences between different development, mixed-use development, and so on. And then 2 latter methods, scaling and weighting, and factor and cluster analysis, which were more academic in nature, but provided the ability to look at a much broader set of environments, which we required for our study, looking at 30-some different systems. Next slide.
I seem unable to advance.
There we go. There you go. That's it. So we ended up picking scaling and weighting for a few reasons. First, it provided the ability to look at similar built environments across different urban areas, but it also provides a relatively easy way for study areas or city areas outside of our study to classify themselves, at least more so than a factor or cluster analysis might do. This approach, scaling and weighting, is based on an approach used for study site sampling in California by Stephen Gerke and Kelly Clifton. Kelly Clifton at Portland State, Stephen Gerke at Northern Arizona University now. This approach developed play types for the state of California, which encompasses a wide variety of urban areas and spatial patterns. And California and Caltrans ended up liking it enough that they appended it to their National Household Travel Survey add-on and are using it as travel survey place types. So we found it to be a very useful way to classify place that's easy to understand and add new study sites within our built environment. Next slide.
Right.
So in this approach, there are multiple, I'll just keep talking. There you go. In this approach, there are several steps. First, we selected built environment characteristics, which we provide on a table on the right. We were emphasizing those that are widely available across the United States. Within each of those built environment indicators, we separate them into jinx breaks, so sort of natural breaks, scored them in according with the level of urbanness or urban accessibility, averaged those scores for each block group, and then aggregated those classifications into 4 place types. So I think originally we came up with 6 or 8, and then as we were looking at them, we realized that some of those categories were very similar in how they function, so we aggregated them down to 4. Next slide. Those 4 place types we define by the level of accessibility, urban accessibility. We categorize them as and labeled them as sort of high, moderate, low, and poor mixed accessibility areas. Again, one of the challenges is we're comparing urban areas that are, or metropolitan areas and systems that are very different in their built environment patterns. And so across these, 9 built environment measures, we have within each category some thresholds that allow us to identify which category, which urban place type they fall within. Next slide. Unfortunately, Robert's not here with us today. He used these place types and created a series of really wonderful maps, which you can find in more detail, as well as information about the place type typology analysis in our report. But these maps start to capture how the built environment varies across different regions, comparing regions together with respect to both the station area and the different proximities, which are shown by the buffers. So these maps have been a useful way for us to identify similar area types and systems across these areas, and they've been used in the analysis, which Chris will talk about next.
Okay, thank you, Kristi. And I'm going to stay here just for a moment. Our report will actually come out, we're told, probably in April sometime. So we'll show you the link to the report at the end of this presentation, but come and visit the report in April. It is actually so large, it's 1,400 pages, that is being divided into 5 volumes. So we have a 5-volume report that will be available, we think, in April. Now, at the end of the presentation, we also give you our individual email addresses. If you don't want to, if you have questions we can answer right now today, you can email us directly or collectively for any questions you have. Then lastly, on these slides, notice that we have rings. These are 1-mile rings around stations. Stations themselves are in bold. We see here the color coding of Kristi's place types. Yellow is poor. Orange is low connectivity and mixed land uses and so forth. Purple is moderate, so you have clustering of residential and employment activities in certain areas, and black is the very center or the highest level of land use connectivity, land use accessibility, density, population, and so forth. So there we go. This is Robert Hibberd. I'm not Robert Hibberd. I wish he was here, but so be it. That was a quick slide of him. Anyway, the first question we're asking here is there a link between transit station proximity and change in workers by economic sector and wage groups across a hierarchy of station area, land use mix, and accessibility types from 2010 to 2016? Basically, what we're doing here, we have 4 transit types: light rail, streetcar, commuter rail, and bus rapid transit. We have 4 place types: the high, which is the high density nodes; the moderate, the low, and the poor. The poor being very inaccessible, and you saw that slide earlier. We have 2 time frames, so we're looking at the difference of between 2010 and 2016. There's no way I'm going to present all of this permutations in these few slides ahead of you. So we're going to pick and choose a few for examples. And getting to the next slide, hopefully. Here we go. Okay, so this first slide is we're looking at bus rapid transit, low mixed use accessibility. That's the orange category, kind of not quite the edge of urban areas, but towards the edge. Looking at job change between 2010 and 2016, and we're looking at percent change. These are huge percents in some cases. And here's the 0 line. And then here we have location quotient change. I don't have enough time to go into these location quotient changes, but you can basically eyeball this and say, okay, for BRT national study of about a dozen BRT systems in a dozen metropolitan areas, looking at the low MA category or place type, we see that healthcare has done really well in locating near, I'm sorry, these are CRT stations. Somehow I've skipped a slide. Okay, low BRT. Healthcare has done well in this. So has office, and so has lower income jobs. So we also looked at the job distribution, looking at jobs by low, middle, high income. And so this is a fairly informative chart. We don't have enough time to go over this, but this is the kind of information you'll have in the report that comes out in April. So healthcare does well, office does well, low paid jobs do well, and some upper income jobs. If you look at CRT, commuter rail transit at poor areas, this is the far-flung metropolitan first stop or last stop commuter rail station. Healthcare again does well, as well as light industry and some manufacturing and retail lodging. So a lot of these actually do quite well. Some don't do as well. Education doesn't do as well, and so forth. And here we see the distribution of jobs. And so again, there's a lot going on here. And we picked two of the, for bus rapid transit and commuter rail transit, some of the more distant stations. So we'll move on here. There we go, light rail transit. Looking at the moderate, this is the not quite highest. This is sort of the, well, it's the moderate, it's the upper middle level place types. Here's the zero line here. We see a lot of positive activity for the most part. And I should have mentioned that these, we're color coding. The darker colors are distance bands from the station outward in 1/8 mile distances. I should have mentioned that earlier, but I hope you can figure that out. And you'll have the slides, of course, after this, so you can study this more carefully. But by and large, light rail transit in moderate place type areas does really well at attracting a wide range of jobs, fairly close to stations and actually out some distance. And they do also very well in all the jobs, almost all the wage categories. So LRT, light rail transit, does pretty well in attracting jobs over time among our metropolitan areas. And streetcar transit in the high place type, imagine downtowns and so forth. Education, we could say almost, except for right at the station itself, education basically is pushed away from streetcar station areas. Arts and entertainment is also pushed away from stations, except the very close ones. Retail, food, and so forth actually is attracted to these stations by quite a margin. And you can see the job distribution. The lower income jobs, lower wage jobs are also attracted towards streetcar stations. You can imagine these are tied then to the retail, food, and lodging sector as well. So now we'll move into the change in people with respect to transit station proximity by mode and by place type for people relative to counties, relative to transit counties. Our measurements are with respect to change in the counties within which these systems operate. So relative to those counties within which transit systems operate, that we call transit counties, are there shifts in the regional share of people over time with respect to fixed rail transit station proximity, particularly with respect to change in people by demographics? So the first one here, first slide, we're combining two modes, bus rapid transit in the high area, the high place type, and commuter rail transit in the low place type. So you can sort of see comparisons, contrasts between types of systems and types of places. And when we see here, here's the zero line in both cases. Overall, except for with exceptions of Native Americans and basically Native Americans and other races, but by and large, for all types of demographic groups, we see a positive attraction to BRT stations in high place types as well as low place types. among the CRT systems we studied and the BRT systems that we studied. For LRT, we see a similar pattern. Again, positive change, shifting of people towards LRT stations, in this case, towards the moderate place type. And for streetcar, again, towards the high place type, downtowns mostly, with very few exceptions. And by the way, these exceptions are very low numerically. So you can see these are percentages. So by and large, the negatives are applicable to very small population groups. Not that they're unimportant, but they are a small overall share of the population. So what we can say here overall is that the place type matters. The more intense, the higher the intensity, the more attractive it is, generally speaking, to people and households, and also certain kinds of jobs, but not all kinds of jobs. Moving on here. So now we'll look at the shift and share by households relative to the transit counties. Are there shifts in the regional share of housing over time with respect to fixed route transportation systems? And we'll see a little same conceptual, but a little different presentation style. Here we're looking at bus rapid transit, contrasting the high place type with the poor place type. And here we see some very interesting trends. So let's look at the BRT high place type. A lot of us in this business, at least me, but I'm sure a lot of us out there in the audience here, have always assumed that transit station areas per se would not be that attractive to households with children. We would focus on 2+ households, adult plus households without children, or one-person households, especially one-person households, especially maybe in downtown areas. Well, surprising to us, we see that households with children are a very strong share of the overall market demand for proximity to, in this case, bus rapid transit stations in high place typologies, and as well as poor place typologies across all of these distances. The single person household is not so much attracted to BRT stations in both cases, to out beyond about 1.5 mile. So there's a lot going on with these tables here too, but you can sort of sense, I would sense that there's maybe a latent demand, unmet demand for meeting the needs of households with children, for at least with respect to BRT stations. But we'll move on here. We'll look at these commuter rail stations, and here's an example of the CRT low place type. And again, we see some attractiveness, not huge attractiveness of households with children very close, but then they seem to be repelled by CRT proximity after about the first quarter mile. But singles are really attracted to CRT stations within 3/8 of a mile forward, more or less. Well, CRT stations, CRT systems are pretty different than bus rapid transit. They're more real regional long distance serving. So you can imagine a single person hopping a train in northern San Diego County and then commuting to downtown and then back. Moving along to light rail transit. Looking at the moderate place type area, here we see again a very strong representation of households with children, stronger representation of 2+ adult households without kids, and fairly modest representation by one-person households, except beyond towards about 1/2 mile and then beyond. So here again, in our view, there is possibly a missing market in our design and land use planning and so forth to recognize households with children might actually be attracted towards rail stations. And we're looking here at streetcar stations, again, looking more downtown. Not for streetcar stations, basically operating mostly in downtown or higher level place types. Households with children are not so represented as the other transit system types were, but here we see 2+ adult households with no children and single person households clearly attracted towards streetcar stations, mostly in downtowns or other higher level place types. And then I'll proceed with an assessment of the extent to which transit systems influence household transportation budgets and also real estate markets. So looking at the first question here, do transportation costs as a share of median household income decline generally over time with respect to light rail station proximity, controlling for other factors? Now, this particular study, we looked only at light rail station proximity. We're using the HUD Location Affordability Index for 2 years. I'll get to that here. Next slide. We're looking at 2 years, American Community Survey for 2008, 2012. That was done at the block group level, so very refined. For ACS 2012, 2016, we're looking at the census tract level. Not as refined as we'd like, but it's the only available data. We're looking at these 2 time frames, changes in time, looking at the household, I don't know what happened. Need to go back. Here we go. So we're looking at 4 types of households, median family household, sort of the overall average. Single parent with kids household at 50% of median household income for the region. Single professional at 135% of median household income for the region. And then dual professional family at 150% median household income for the region. In almost all, for the single parent case mostly, in almost all cases, we're seeing that the savings households enjoy being closer to stations increases between time periods. So this is interesting. So once a station, once a system or station is in place, it takes a while for the market to respond to it. But as the market does respond to it, the market says, at least for certain household types, we enjoy the savings that the proximity has to our transportation budget. And so this is the reflection of that. And then we see the same thing for these other household types. And so, yeah, so let's move on to the next. So implications from this analysis is that by and large, we sense, and other data show this in our report that comes out in April, by and large, our data indicates that older households, say over 35, households with higher income, households that are mature, good jobs and so forth, appear to be squeezing other households away from locations near transit stations. Call that gentrification, call that displacement, whatever you call that, call it good, call it bad, whatever it is. This is what we're finding in our analysis. And so if our policies are geared towards serving broader needs of households than just certain types of households, we might need to find ways to increase the supply of housing for more household types. One of those household types could be the households with children, the single parent household in particular being squeezed away from proximity to transit stations because we're not thinking that households with children might be attracted to those stations. So we might try to rethink some of our planning and transit policies and housing policies to broaden the mix of housing near transit stations. Now we'll move on to the effect of transit station proximity on real estate rents. Is there an association between commercial real estate rent per square foot and proximity to rail transit stations holding all of the factors constant? And if there's an association, is there evidence of negative externality or positive amenity effects with respect to transit station proximity? And I'll show you what that means in the next slides coming up. So if we find that rents, and we're looking for rents, we're looking at office, retail, and multifamily. I'm going to get back to that slide. I don't know, I'm trying to go forward.
Hi, Chris, how many slides would you like to go forward?
Okay, stop here.
Okay.
Yeah, Brendan, I guess it's best to have you take control. My control doesn't work.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's this is a shakedown cruise for this new technology. So in the where we have rents decline with respect to distance from rail transfer stations, this is a good thing because this tells us that the closer you are to the station, the higher the rent, which means you're capitalizing the amenity value of proximity to the rail station itself. That's a good thing. We want to see that. Next slide. If we see the rents increasing away from stations, that means the stations are themselves a source of externalities. The station design, the traffic, the noise, the urban design, the lack of connectivity, whatever it is, those are in aggregate negatives on rent. And that's a bad thing because we're putting all this money into transit stations. If we're finding the market doesn't respond positively to accessibility, then that's a bad outcome. Next slide. If we find no relationship, positive or negative, this is an ambiguous relationship. That's also bad because we need to find something. We should find something. So maybe nothing is better than negative, but nothing tells us nothing about what we can do in policy to improve land use patterns. Next slide. More complex are relationships where the amenity value and the externality value intertwine together. So close to the station, you have the accessibility amenity value combined with the externality effect. So in this particular case, in a convex sloping rent gradient, the amenity value overcomes the externality value at the station, but eventually the externality value basically overcomes the amenity value at some point, and then the externality value basically takes over. Next slide. And then the converse of that would be the concave, and that's where the externality value overcomes the amenity value, and we see the reverse slope. And this is a bad relationship. Next slide. So here we're going to walk through the effect of transit station proximity and real estate rents, looking first at light rail transit. So let's look first at retail land use, retail activities. Now we're looking at distance bands of 1/8 mile to 1 mile. We chose distance bands because it has a lot of intuitive interpretation possibilities and also very applicable for transit and land use planning applications. So notice that for retail, for light rail transit station proximity, and by the way, we're not looking at by place type. We've actually factored out place type. So this is factoring all factors, including place type. So what's left over is the overall relationship between retail and distance from transit stations, light rail transit stations. We see a downward sloping gradient and then slightly upward after about 1/2 mile. This is good. The market is paying more rent to be closer to LRT stations. That's a good signal that the retail market values proximity to those stations. After a certain point, it basically conforms to the theory about diminishing returns. Then for multifamily, we find basically the relationship is up and down and up and down and up and down, essentially flat. There's really no positive or negative relationship. Actually, close in, there's a negative relationship coming closer to the station. This is a bad outcome. We should do our urban planning, urban design, and other activities to make transit station proximity attractive to multifamily near LRT stations. But look at office. It's actually concave. From about 1/2 mile closer in, rents fall. Now, we could say this is bad on the whole, and it is theoretically bad, but maybe there's something else going on here. So we sort of have to take a look at this holistically. Retail is positive and strong. Residential is flat, not up or down, but maybe the combination of retail and multifamily overcomes the competitiveness of office. So maybe these activities are pushing office further out to where they can compete for rent a little farther away. And after all, retail probably needs to be very close to transit, and people need to be maybe closer to transit than offices. So that's one of the things we'd be looking at more carefully in terms of the implications for light rail transit systems. Next slide, please. Then looking at streetcar transit, let's again start with retail. We start off of rents going down pretty sharply, then back up. This could be anomalous with the data. We don't know what's going on here. But basically, the slope is more or less downward sloping. This is a good sign that retail more or less is favoring proximity to access to streetcar stations. With multifamily, we see the same thing. Actually, we see a very strong upward slope from a mile away all the way up to basically where the streetcar stations are. This is another good outcome. And then now we see for office an upward sloping gradient, and then there's ambiguous relationships here. But let's focus on this area here. Office rents go up the farther away they are from streetcar stations. On the surface, this is a bad outcome, but this could merely be the effect of retail and residential ganging up on locations near streetcar stations and pushing office further out. Next slide, please. For bus rapid transit, this is a real mess. There's a lot going on here, and not all of it good. And in our view, there's a lot of things we can learn about how the market responds to bus rapid transit in terms of real estate that can suggest to us that we need to do better planning, better urban design around bus rapid transit stations. So mostly there's an ambiguous result from BRT stations outward about the first quarter mile. So except for a little bit of retail, residential is upward sloping, that's bad, or office is downward sloping, that's good from BRT, but there's a no man's land right here in the first quarter mile. So by and large, land uses don't want to be near BRT stations, and that could be a design problem, location problem, and other kinds of problems. Now, by the way, these results are aggregated over all the metropolitan areas we're studying. Our report shows you results for each and every metropolitan area, for each place type, for each mode. And so if you drill into our study, this is, I think, in volume 3 of our study, volume 4 of our study, you'll get into the nuts and bolts of particular metropolitan areas. And we think there's a lot to be learned by studying a metropolitan area for what it does right or wrong. If you want to design systems or stations for your metropolitan area based on our analysis. Next slide, please. For commuter rail transit, this is very interesting. Very steep downward slope for retail. Retail is a very strong reaction to proximity to CRT stations. We think there's a lot of reasons for that. We talk about it in our report. For office, we see high rents towards the station itself. But for multifamily, not so much. Multifamily only materializes significantly at about a half a mile, and then is kind of not so good after 1/2 mile. But this depends on the system. Look at the San Diego system, and multifamily rents are upward sloping towards the stations themselves. So again, San Diego, we can say, is probably doing a very good job of land use planning and housing provision and so forth near and beyond the CRT transit stations. Next slide, please. So overall implications for transit and land use planning, place matters. And place, by place, we mean a combination of the mix of land uses, the density, the interactivity of transportation options, street intersections, and so forth. So the more mix, the more activity, the more centrality, the more place matters in terms of transit station outcomes. Next slide, please. The economic group matters. We see that depending on the place and depending on the system, certain jobs are attracted to or even repelled by transit stations. And so there's a lot we can do to improve our mix of land use planning and long-range planning by looking at the particular effects of transit proximity by mode, by place type on economic sectors and on wage sectors. Next slide, please. Demographics matter. I think I just talked about that at some length. I want to, in the interest of time, let's move on. Next slide, please. And real estate rents. We spent a lot of time on real estate rents. The bottom line here is that we've shown you how the market ought to respond to proximity to transit stations. And this is these are strong signals. If we don't find the desired outcome in the market, that means we're doing something wrong in our planning, in our location of stations, in something. And this is a signal for us to overcome these outcomes if they're negative, or reinforce the outcomes if they're positive. Next slide, please. So the final report will be available in April. Here's the address for it. It'll be 5 volumes, a total of about 1,400 pages, downloadable fully. It includes detailed tables for each of the systems as well. Next slide, please. Last slide. And here are our email addresses. If you have any questions for us, write us individually or collectively. We'll be happy to respond to you. And also, we encourage you to download this report or this slide presentation after the program. And of course, download the whole report in April. So we have some minutes left. Thank you all very much. And Brendan, I guess you're going to field the questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. Thank you, Kristina. So yeah, we have a little over 10 minutes. If you have any questions, please submit them now. We've received a couple. I guess, Kristina, I know you're gonna have to leave early and this might go on a little bit. So I'd like to just get a sense from you of where you see going forward with this research. Chris has mentioned that this is like the last of 4 reports, but really he's in the report, it talks about being a foundation for the future.
Yeah, yeah, I think Chris could add a lot to this. For those of you who don't know Robert's dissertation is building on this work in a lot of different ways, and I think he's one, for those of you who are interested in this area, to look out for the things that he is doing in particular. I think with the pandemic, there's ongoing interest in understanding what are the impacts of the pandemic. If you look back to some of the things that Chris has done, from which this study came from, he's looked at the 2008 recession, and there are quite a few lessons that I think can be learned in terms of what can be expected from the pandemic. And I think that this work as a decade of research, and from what Robert will produce in his dissertation and move forward on, there's an awful lot to understand how the influences of different development and transportation investments can impact economic development and vice versa. So Chris, do you have other ideas and things?
Well, yeah, I do actually. Even though the report, believe it or not, is 1,400 pages, it doesn't tell the whole story. And the whole story is when you drill down into individual metropolitan areas or individual slices by place type, or you name it. Fortunately, thanks to Robert, actually, PSU has our entire data set for this report, which really is a compendium of all the work we've done in this field. The data are in accessible Excel format. We have a data dictionary for you. So it's intended to distribute our data to students, to scholars, to policy analysts, to allow them to drill down, ask their questions, and have them drill down into the fine points of policy implications and planning implications. And so, if anything, that's our lasting legacy by providing a platform for future analysis for future generations of researchers. And by the way, our data, even though it only goes to 2016, we'd love to have it go to 2018 or something. All of our data are pre-COVID. So it gives researchers a good pre-COVID platform to compare maybe during, and post-COVID outcomes by metropolitan area, by transit system, by place type, by household type, by job type, you just name it. We give you the platform to do future analysis.
All right, so let's dive into some of these questions. And I think that they're really, it's like what you're saying there, Chris, and encouraging people to be curious and look at your data. But what sort of things have you seen as far as first, last mile solution effects?
You know, Krista, you want to talk about this? You've actually gotten into first, last mile more than I have. If not, that's okay. I can do something.
I'm not sure that this analysis captures that necessarily just yet. I think that that could be, especially as that data becomes more available of what is available across different cities. And for things like e-scooters, we're seeing a lot of that data either become publicly available or available to individual cities. That would be, for any students who are on the line, that would be a really fascinating thing to merge with this data and do more analysis on that.
That's right. You know, our data, our detailed data go out 2 miles from stations. And whether the stations themselves are the first or the last mile from whatever you're looking at, it might help you answer part of the first or last mile question, or even 2 mile question. We do have a lot of implications for the mile around, or even the 2 miles around these stations. And again, one of the things that I'll mention, I think we're missing the mark in terms of designing areas closer to transit stations to be attractive to households with families, or with children, I should say. In other analysis we have published by the Transportation Research Record, we also found, and by the way, you'll have these data too in our databases, we found that even though areas very close, say within a 1/4 mile of transit stations, account for 5 or actually 2% of the entire land area, the entire urban land area of a region, they attracted something like 10–15% of all the development in the region. So the numbers that you might see for the numbers of jobs or people locating your stations within the first, say, 1/4 mile, they might look small, but in terms of a relationship on the land base they occupy, it's a huge difference. And that's something we're going to explore in our own future research.
Great. Kristina, do you want to respond to this parking question?
Yeah, I was actually just typing a response before I leave. So in many academic studies, the argument is that parking supply and parking constraints are correlated with the built environment. In an ongoing study with Caltrans, where we're trying to link parking supply with vehicle impacts for transportation impact analyses, we're finding that that correlation is not as strong as people often think it is. That correlation can be something like 0.4, which is not enough to leave it out of the equation. So the built environment measures that we're using do not include controls for parking. I'm not sure, and maybe this is something Chris might know, the role of parking in some of these economic indicators. But I will say in our study in Caltrans, which is still ongoing, one of our big questions is how we bring parking into other travel behavior metrics. And I think another fruitful area of future research is identifying ways to develop parking data that can be used in analyses like these, because it remains one of the biggest missing variables in a number of analyses like this.
Oh,
Nice.
yes, parking. So we didn't really measure parking per se in our analysis. It's sort of inferred. There's another chapter in our report that we didn't even touch on, and that is express bus. And we find that for distant suburban places, express bus accessibility is positive on multifamily rent away from the station, because immediately around the station are parking lots. But once you get away from the parking lot, we find higher rents. And so that's telling us that what if we can design parking lots to include multifamily residential in a nice, attractive urban design format? Maybe we can have the best of both worlds of rising rents, still provide parking and meet housing needs at express bus stations and maybe even commuter rail stations. There's a question here also that somebody mentioned. Did we measure the frequency and hours of operation as an impact on real estate value? Short answer is no. It turns out the data simply don't exist for us to do that across metropolitan areas. Now, some metropolitan areas have those data. It would be quite a feat to do our analysis for those metropolitan areas. It wouldn't be impossible, but it is impossible across the country because those data simply are not collected centrally for us to download and use.
Yeah,
Oh, some student. Oh, one of my former students. Nice to see you. That was question number 3 or something.
yeah.
I miss Georgia Tech. I enjoy Arizona, Utah, but I miss Georgia Tech.
That's great. So, Chris, the next question also is diving into this study. Kristina, I don't know if you have to go. I just want to say thanks so much for participating. I hope you have a great day and everything, and we really appreciate it and look forward to having you back because you are involved in other research projects.
So actually, Brendan, before we end here, I have a note from Jan Cervelli, my former dean here at Arizona. And she asked the question, did you find any differences across regions relative to climate and the impact of climate on transit use and land use pattern around transit stations? Jan, first of all, hello, good to see you. I can't see you, I guess, but hello. We didn't look necessarily at climate, but I have to give you an anecdote. Some years ago, I did a study on the use of commuters, use of the bicycle for commuters in their journey to work. And we had a database across the country, north, south, east, west, mountains, valleys, you name it. And we were convinced that climate would play a very large role in the willingness of people to commute by bicycle to work. And we had this huge database, and we had all kinds of interesting data, and the results were published in Transportation Research Record in the late 1990s. And guess what? The metropolitan areas that had the grungiest climates had the highest use of bikeways and pathways for commuting to work by bicycle. Seattle, Madison, Wisconsin, and other places like that. Now, maybe they were designed for bicycles, and they are. And so the point was that if you build these facilities, commuters will actually use them regardless of the climate. And so I'm thinking that we can take sort of the same psychology here, that it doesn't really matter what the climate is, certainly some, but if you design for the climate, you can make transit work. And that might be another research project we should get into.
Chris, also we have a question on the different modes of transportation and real estate rent. I'm wondering if you have time to talk about, basically, I think of the idea of, planning for light rail or a lot of these other things takes a long time, and there's a specific area it's going through, and we know. And people sort of think about, well, the property values are going to go up there versus maybe adding a bus line. I don't know if there's some sort of difference you've seen, something.
There's a lot of interesting research, and actually Aaron Golub has done a lot of this at Portland State, looking at the speculative effect of announced transit plans on real estate markets. And he has a very good study actually out of the Phoenix area. When the light rail system was announced there was rampant speculation of land, overpricing of land. Land was so expensive that developers couldn't buy it or develop it. And it took the real estate crash of the late 2000s to squeeze out speculative value. And so then development could go in because then values were more realistic. But I think as a rule of thumb, you can basically say, just imagine a large matrix. The higher the place type, from poor to low to moderate to high, and the closer you are to a station, and on a continuum of station investment from bus rapid transit to commuter rail transit to streetcar transit to light rail transit, you'll see the higher the level of intensity and investment, the higher the property values should be, or the rents should be. If you don't see that, there's something wrong. There's something wrong in your planning, something wrong in your design, something wrong with the market under assumptions. So you need to go in assuming that you will expect higher rents in certain areas, and if you don't find them, then something is wrong with the system. So yeah, there's a lot we can do with this study, with these insights for individual metropolitan areas and metropolitan areas as a whole, to right size or fix or make better the relationship between transit investments and land use planning. And oh, by the way, as we sign off here, one of the worst things you can have happen, and I've seen this across the country, one of the worst things you can do is put a lot of money into a transit station and rip out the land uses around the transit station, and then don't do your land use planning to rebuild those areas. So you don't even get gentrification. You have displacement with no replacement, and you kill whole neighborhoods, kill whole communities. That's, so we need to be mindful of the effect of transit stations on neighborhoods themselves. And yes, they will impact neighborhoods, but what can we do to mitigate those impacts and actually make those impacts more favorable to the existing residents of those areas? That's a whole other area of research that we need to get into.
Great. So yeah, it is after the, we're beyond an hour now. I want to thank you so much, Chris. I want to also apologize just for the technical issues. But is there anything you'd like to wrap up with, or you?
Well, Christy and I say this was the title of our study here was Final Phase. Really, yes, it is a final phase in terms of a lot of conceptualization. We create the platform for future analysis, but that's it. We've now given everybody the platform. It's now time to go further with this, exploring many of these other areas, the climate, the frequency and time of use, the actual land use configurations around stations, and so on. So this is not the final phase. If anything, this is the first phase for the next generation of research by students and faculty and others. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate it so much, Chris. And thank you all for joining us today. As we have numerous events coming up. We have our Friday transportation seminars, and we have our monthly webinars. So I encourage you to join. Encourage you to check out reports such as the final report for this project and look at the data as well. And yeah, thank you again. Take care.